Hey everyone, what's up? This is Uri for Upswing Poker, and in this video I'm going to be talking about how to gain edges in kind of rare spots, and we're going to be focusing on 4 to a flush boards. The rarer a spot is in general, the less people know about it, and the more your potential, the higher your potential is to outplay them. The best example would be if the flop comes Jack, Jack, Jack. I bet you very few professional poker players have any clue what their strategy or their opponent's strategy should look like. Now, granted, the spot is rare, but the rarer the spot, the more potential for win rate you have. So I want to focus in this video on 4 flush boards and specifically on turn barreling on 4 flush boards. We're going to randomly take this 10-9-6 monotone board, button versus big blind. Button will bet quarter pot, big blind will call, and we'll look at the turn ace of spades and take a look at in position strategy. And focus here is going to be on bluffs because value bets I think are fairly obvious, although the solver likes slow playing the straight flush, but other than that, fairly obvious. Just value bet the nuts a lot. When you think about bluffing on 4 flush boards, I think a lot of guys, when they get to the turn in a 4 flush board, that's when they start thinking about do they want to bluff or not with their hand. And it's, first of all, it's a situation where people give off physical tells and timing tells because often they didn't expect the 4 flush, and the 4 flush changes everything in terms of relative hand value. So definitely a spot to pay attention to, and I would hope you guys are prepared in advance. So what can we bluff with on 4 flush boards? The thing on 4 flush boards is, if you don't have a flush, you're not generally getting there. So this isn't a spot where you want to bluff necessarily with an open-ended straight draw or a gut shot or with overcards. All of these things become a lot less relevant than they usually would be. And generally, you just kind of want to bluff with weak hands. So here, an example of a hand you might bluff with would be deuces, no spade. This is not generally a hand you would be betting very often. Or I guess 6-4, no spade. These are not hands you would be betting in general very often. But when there's 4 to a flush, they have very little showdown value, and you need to take your bluffs from somewhere, so they're okay. Straight draws are also okay, but not the best. There's an issue with straight draws where by betting and getting called, you narrow your opponent's range to being mostly flushes. And then hitting your straight is worth a lot less than had you checked back. So actually you would much rather bluff with something like pocket deuces or a bad gut shot than you would with something like an open-ender. Now, one additional thing you might think about when you look at the sim is, okay, so we have flushes betting, mostly high ones, some nuts, some second nuts, and that's it. We have various bluffs trying to pick weak hands, weak pairs, weak draws, just weak hands in general. And then it looks like we are actually betting with most sets and with ace-10, top 2, and with ace-9 sometimes. Now, in an ordinary situation, this wouldn't be surprising. Of course you bet these, but it's not like we're betting a straight. We don't bet a straight. So these bets are actually very unintuitive. And back in the day, nobody used to make them. And there used to be a dynamic where if in position bet the turn and got called and the board got paired, in position would have 0 boats. And then out of position might consider developing a donk betting range. But why does the solver want to bet these hands? And I always feel like it's extremely important to understand why something is happening. Because when I look at this, if I don't understand why, in game, in the heat of the moment, I'm not going to want to do it because it feels a bit weird. So let's try to think about what's going on with these hands when we're betting. First off, these are not value bets because a hand like ace-10 has 50% equity before betting. Hand like 10s has 57. And if you bet half pot and get called, Tens would drop to 44, ace 10 would drop to 33, nines would drop to 44 as well, actually higher than tens. Because when you bet nines, your opponent has more tens to call you with, and tens is not really in his range in these positions, so no, not important either way. So these aren't value bets, but they are pushing some equity. They are, they're not destroying themselves completely, and they are gaining a fair bit of protection. And if I were to kind of sum up why are sets in top 2 betting here, I'd say it's a thin value bet, or we could call it a protection bet, and at the same time it's a draw. And this is a board where you need more protection than usual. So let me try to break down all those things for you guys. It's a thin value bet because when you bet on 10, 9, 6 ace, your opponent is going to want to call with flushes, but he can't call only flushes, and then the next best hand to call is his both draws, right? Like 2 pairs and sets. And when you have your best, like your sets or your top 2, you are gaining value versus your opponent's 2 pairs that are calling and your opponent's worst hands that are calling. So it is sort of a value bet. This is not a spot where you bet half pot and your opponent's calling only flushes, right? Ranges are certainly wider than that. And there's actually a really cool thing where if ranges were a bit narrower, or in this instance, if we bet bigger, like a pot-sized bet, our opponent would still call us with 2 pair plus. So hands like a6 and 9-6 and 10-6, but he would start folding some low flushes. The cool thing about this is that now tens is something like 10s or 9s or 6s or ace 10 are in this unique situation where you bet and your opponent both calls you with worse and folds better at the same time. It's a very unique thing in poker, but it's important to pay attention to, because whenever you have a hand that can accomplish like both of these things, getting called by worse and folding out better at the same time, you have a hand that you should strongly consider betting, irregardless of whether it's a value bet or not, right? It's not that important that it's a value bet. It's just improving its own situation, right? And you might even imagine an extreme scenario where a hand with 20% equity bets the turn, and after getting called, it jumps up to 25% equity, which would be crazy. But that kind of thing might happen in some imaginary scenario, not in this scenario though. So, okay, these hands are kind of thin value bets. Why are they protection bets? Now, generally, it's not thought that hands like sets need protection. But once the board is 4 to a flush, every hand in your opponent's range can hit a spade to chop with your set or your top 2. So against our pocket tens, if our opponent has pocket deuces, no spade, he actually has 9 outs to improve, which is, roughly 20% to chop the pot, which you can call 10% equity. And you guys can kind of see that here where when we bet, I guess kind of the equity of a hand like deuce 3 of hearts for out of position is actually 10% here, which is crazy. That hand has nothing. It should have 0% equity, but it has 10% because it's going to chop more than you think. So this actually creates a scenario where Hold'em becomes a bit more like pot limit Omaha, where all of your opponent's range has some equity, and you're actually a bit happy to make him fold worse hands. It's not so cut and dry like normal no limit Hold'em where you're way ahead, way behind. It's much more dynamic type of situation. So this is a spot that merits protection betting. These hands achieve protection. And of course, the last thing which we haven't mentioned, which is a really big one, is that sets are draws to the nuts. Because this board, if you have a set, is going to pair on 10 river cards, so roughly 22% of the time, and then you're going to make the nuts on the river. And now that's a big draw. That's bigger than an open-ended straight draw. It's bigger than a flush draw in terms of number of outs, and it's to the nuts. So these hands are kind of doing a few things at the same time. They are thin value betting, they are protection betting, and they're also nut draws. So once you understand all these things, I hope it makes a lot of sense. It's not usual that your hand is a protection bet and a draw to the nuts at the same time. That's like a pair plus flush draw type hand. But yeah, maybe you guys can start seeing why those hands make good bets as well some of the time. Which other situations could this come up in? Pause the video, try to think. If there is another situation other than 4 to a flush, where a hand like top 2 or a set would be both a draw to the nuts and a protection bet due to the dynamic nature of the board, and a thin value bet due to getting called by a bunch of worse hands, and sometimes fold out better. Like we said here, sometimes you would fold out straights on this kind of board if the ranges were tight enough or the sizes were big enough. Okay, so now that you guys have thought about it, we're going to look at 4 to a straight. Now 4 to a straight, button versus big blind, 10, 8, 7, 9. We half pot the flop, 9 of diamonds turn. Very similar situation, because on a jack or a 6, our set or 2 pair starts chopping with everything. This means that our opponent has, with a hand like deuce 3 of spades, again, close to 10% equity versus our range. And it means that we have more incentive to get those hands to fold. And indeed, you do see that solver likes betting here with 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s, so all the sets and top 2 pair, and also 9-7, which is 2 pair plus a flush draw. So also the same, you get some protection, you're pushing a tiny bit of equity, you still get called by 7-8. Or queen 10 or hands like that, and you have a big draw to the nuts, which is a relevant component of the hand. We're not used to thinking of hold'em hands as having components, but in some cases they do. I want you guys to think when we learn something like this. So we've learned a few new things. I don't know how much is new for everyone watching, but that you want to bluff with pretty chunky stuff on 4 flush boards rather than draws, and that you also want to bet, I can't call it bluff, with sets and good 2 pairs. Now, as an exploitative player, the first thing you should be asking yourself is, okay, how many of my opponents are doing any of these things? And if someone is not doing one of them, what can I do to adjust my strategy, if anything? Sometimes the answer is nothing, to gain a further edge against them on 4 flush boards. Because you already gain an edge by playing correctly, but often this edge can be greatly magnified if you can kind of pinpoint the weaknesses in your opponent's strategy and construct an exploitative counter strategy to that. All that being said, let's watch the end of the high stakes poker hand, which happens to be the same board.
Ace of spades on the turn.
Doyle checks his flush. Very interesting. The one guy that doesn't have a spade
Right.
comes out betting.
5,500.
Now Holtman is thinking Daniel's betting into 2 people. He's got the 3rd best hand. King of spades or queen of spades would beat him, and either one of these guys could have it. He's going to call, but I don't see him raising.
Yeah. He calls.
And I think Doyle's going to let his 8 of spades go.
There's another 6 for Daniel.
An inconsequential 6. I think Daniel is pretty sure where Holtman is at. That he's got like the jack of spades. Maybe a hand like Doyle had, the 8 of spades. And when world-class players smell weakness, they act on it. And that's exactly what Daniel is fixing to do.
Yep. That's 36,000.
Bets 36,000, just like he had the king of spades.
36,000. Yes.
Now that we understand how 4 flushboards play, I think Negreanu's play on the turn makes perfect sense. And his river huge bet is clearly telegraphing that he knows his range is supposed to have a bunch of boats because he knows that he is supposed to bet with sets on the turn. I would still personally prefer a different bet size. I think ranges here are a bit narrow. And were Negreanu to bet the king high flush, he'd have to go smaller. I think the majority of his value betting range is king high flush. So I feel like there is some kind of nitpicky technical mistake, but it's not an important one. And it's not one that's easy to exploit. You have to go very, very deep in order to exploit something like this. So I would not even call this a mistake.
Holtman is in a tough spot. When you're not used to playing with players at this level, it's hard to believe anyone would do this.
Right.
What should make him a little suspicious is that the board's paired. And Daniel's still making a big bet.
Be nice if you bluff.
Nice if I bluff.
First big bluff of the season. Looks like things are heating up.
Well played hand by Daniel. Hopefully you guys can understand what was going on a bit better. And as I said, the focus should always be whenever you learn something like this. You want to implement it into your game. But at the same time, think about your environment, think about the people you're playing with, and try to come up with, if people are not doing this, how can I exploit that? That's it for this video. See you guys in the next one.